Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA, it's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore. It tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort, and over the past year and a half, I've interviewed several scholars and experts from around the globe. Now, this particular episode is about India. And I have with me Siddharth Varadarajan. He's a former editor of The Hindu and founding editor of The Wire. He began his career as a journalist in 95, so he's been around for a long time. With him is Dr.Yaqoob Bangash, who's Associate Professor of South Asian History at Information Technology University. And most importantly, the convener of Afkar-e-Taza, which is the Think Fest, which has been a yearly event for the last 8 years. So welcome to the program, gentlemen. So here's how I'm going to play this.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about India and then about India-Pakistan relations. So as far as the discussion about India is concerned, I'm going to divide it into 4 parts. The umbrella being how India has changed under Prime Minister Narendra Modi's right-wing government. And under this umbrella, I want to discuss India's approach to minorities, and a clear move towards populist or majoritarian, if you will, authoritarianism, India's muscular approach to security, the muzzling of the media, and the saffronization or perhaps the popularization of the armed forces, and some even say the judiciary. So let me begin with a quote from the Human Rights Watch 2023 report. And it says the Bharatiya Janata Party-led government continued its systematic discrimination and stigmatization of religious and other minorities, particularly Muslims. BJP supporters increasingly committed violent attacks against targeted groups. The government's Hindu majoritarian ideology was reflected in bias in institutions, including the justice system and constitutional authorities like the National Human Rights Commission. So let's begin with a comment on this. How far does this accurately reflect the situation?
I'm not sure when that was written, but
it's
I would
2023.
say, I would say it's not only accurate, but it confirms. I think the direction India has is on right now. Evidence is piling that that trend very much continues. So I would say it is accurate, broadly speaking. Yes.
Okay. So Yaqoob, we have seen this in Pakistan. We've constantly been talking about the military's interference in politics. We have been agitating this issue for a very long time. We have also had a right-wing problem, which fortunately in our case did not reflect in terms of headcount in parliament, but in terms of street power. So, and we've seen that the state has been actively pushing back against this trend for various reasons. Now, as a South Asian, historian of South Asia, shall I say, who watches Pakistan very closely, or also India, how far are you worried about these changing trends in India?
Thank you, Ejaz. I think it's a very worrying direction because, one of the main points of any constitution in the world is to control the majority, or else, the majority can do whatever it wants. So therefore, you have a constitution. In the 1970s in India, it was challenged. Then you had a basic structure kind of a doctrine that the Supreme Court endorsed, which basically said, okay, you need to, remain secular, federal, all those kinds of things. But what's been happening in the last 10 years, and that's the real fascinating bit, is that without restructuring that, they've been managing to get away with this. So, and I think that's where the difference is. Pakistan is officially an Islamic republic. Pakistan officially has Islam as a state religion. It has religion infused in every part of the constitution. India doesn't. And yet the ground reality of it is increasingly becoming similar. So whereas in Pakistan, of course, they have more street power, not that much parliamentary power. In India, they have parliamentary power. And the way they've been getting away with it and the way they've been adding on to it, that is a real question of concern. And I think that is the real question. How can it be reversed? And I think that's really the $1 million question, because they're
Okay.
able to from within. And the best example is the recent one, where all of a sudden they began using the word Bharat. And it's very interesting. Of course, Bharat has been in the constitution for 73 years, but it's just that it wasn't used in this way. So they're instrumentalizing, whatever is there to increase their power without actually changing anything. And I think that's a real cause of concern, and that really causing to question the whole liberal constitutional democratic framework that India has been built upon.
Okay. So, Siddharth, I was watching Al Jazeera just a few days ago, the Inside Story, one of their programs, as you know. And this was about the consecration of Ram Temple. And there was one guest, Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay, who, as you know, wrote the book, The Demolition and the Verdict. And he said that the move is to restore Hindu dignity, shore up the Hindu pride, and use it as a political weapon for the impending parliamentary election. And his views were also endorsed by Sharath Pradhan, who's a journalist, as you know, also writes for your publication, The Wire. And they also said that as far as the Indian Supreme Court's 2019 verdict on the Babri Mosque is concerned, for decades to come, it will be one of the most questionable verdicts, because the SC itself spoke about the installation of Hindu idols stealthily placed in the mosque in 1949 as a criminal act, and then the vandalism in 1992 also as a criminal act, and yet went on to give a verdict which they're talking about as something which was questionable.
So I want to respond on two planes.
Okay.
The first is to look at the politics and the constitutionality of the so-called consecration event at Ayodhya on January 22nd, and examine what it tells us about the nature of Indian politics today and the Indian state.
Okay.
And the second is to point to a couple of important aspects of that Supreme Court verdict of 2019, which paved the way for what we saw. Okay. So on the first point, the BJP, there was an interview I saw recently of Dr. S. Jaishankar, who is India's foreign minister.
Yeah.
He was, I think, speaking to Lionel Barber of the FT, and he was asked question. I think he was asked either there or in some other forum. He was asked a question about the kind of discrimination against Muslims that Human Rights Watch and others have spoken about. And he said, look, there is no discrimination, and that all religions are treated equally as far as government policy is concerned. And this has been the standard kind of BJP response. I would say it's in a way earlier Indian state rhetoric too, right? That Indian secularism was not defined in the French way, of there being a strict separation between religion and state, but that the state was equally forgiving or obliging of all religions.
Okay.
So to that extent, so this is the official definition of Indian secularism, right? That we treat all religions equally. But yes, a PM may go to a religious event, or a minister may do this, or somebody may do that, but they go everywhere, right? So this, I would say, conceit of the BJP and of the Indian government that we treat all religions equally was exposed as a big fraud on Jan 22nd, when you had the Prime Minister himself as a constitutional functionary officiating as some kind of a priest. And even if we accept the argument that as a citizen he has every right to worship in a way that he wants, he's after all a practicing Hindu, and what's wrong, blah, blah, blah. Don't forget that in the eyes of the state, and I'm not getting into the politics and the legality of the Supreme Court's judgment, which handed the site of the Babri Masjid to the Ram Temple people. But in the eyes of the state, there was, as a result of the Supreme Court's verdict, a temple to be built and a mosque to be built.
But that mosque, but there's not a single brick. Yeah, precisely.
And the Supreme Court allocated land, for that mosque. Now, if you were to follow Dr. Jayashankar's logic, the PM should have been equally committed to building the temple as he was to the mosque, especially since the Supreme Court's verdict had said in clear terms that the demolition of the mosque in 1992 was a grave, it was an egregious violation of the rule of law.
Correct.
Right. So you don't need, and it's not rocket science, right? A crime is committed, and the Supreme Court, in attempting to so-called redress that crime, had allocated land for the new mosque. So the PM should be equally committed to both, but he isn't.
Yeah.
Right. So you can see in the way in which he chose to take part in that event as the primary karta dharta, that here is the PM who is openly declaring his allegiances, and of course doing so for political reasons. Nilanjan and Sharad Pradhan are right that this is what, and it's by the way, there is no, Hindus are not in need of any redemption or in need of any kind of succor or in need of any. I mean, Hindus are the majority in this country. There is, they are confident believers, and there is no problem that they face as Hindus. They don't need any kind of state support in this way.
Which is
this is a fabricated
right.
grievance.
Yeah,
this is a fabricated sense of grievance.
Precisely. So Sharad was making exactly this point.
Exactly.
And he said that this whole spectacle is essentially political, because it's not like Ram needed this spectacle for Ram to come alive, which is obviously a very sensible argument.
In fact, many spiritual Hindus would actually balk at this kind of spectacle that Mr. Modi mounted and see this as an insult to Ram, right? I mean, you can make a valid theological argument if you're a believing Ram Bhakt, that this is a grave insult that's been done to Ram and Ram's traditions, right? But let's leave that aside and let me come back to the legal issue.
Okay.
The Supreme Court, and what's truly dangerous about the Supreme Court's verdict, in a way, is that it, first of all, decided to hand over the site where a mosque had been criminally demolished by its own acknowledgement. It decided to hand that land over to the very people who were implicated in that crime.
Correct.
It's a bizarre judgment, and I think I see, quite frankly, proof that the judges knew that this was a very shady judgment.
Yeah.
That unlike any other judgment of the Supreme Court, this is an unsigned judgment. So no judge has taken ownership in terms of who drafted this judgment. Every other judgment of the Supreme Court says this judgment was written by so and so, endorsed by so and so, right? So this is somehow an anonymous judgment, which they have put out, and it makes this observation, and it's bizarre, right? That you condemn it as a crime, but then you give it to those people who committed the crime in a way. But there was an interesting line, and this I think will help us to move the discussion forward. There was an interesting line in that judgment where the court actually paid tribute to a 1991 law passed in India, which said that there will be no change in the character of any place of worship as it existed on August the 15th, 1947. So in 1991, as the Babri Masjid movement was hitting a certain crescendo, the parliament decided that we have to put a lid on these kinds of future developments. As far as the Babri Masjid dispute is concerned, the genie is already out. But we are not going to allow, Parliament of India in its sovereign wisdom said, we are not going to allow any other place of worship, the identity of it, to be assailed in a court of law. Right? So it put an end, it was supposed to put an end to all litigation on claims. And, fair enough, right? Because in 1947, India became an independent country. India became a sovereign country, wedded to a modern outlook. You're not going to go back in history 300, 500, 600,000.
But that's precisely what is happening, and not not surprisingly, if you will, for reasons that are very modern and political. But let me, before I pull in Yaqoob on this, because there are a number of other issues that I want to bring into the discussion, let me just read out an excerpt from this recent piece that Pratap Bhanu Mehta wrote in the Indian Express. The sheer spectacle of the, he's talking about the consecration, the sheer spectacle of the event now fusing modified but still traditional yama and niyama with mass broadcasting and mass mobilization is itself considered an achievement. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi now donning the mantle of Hindu kingship has the ability to get millions of people to play their parts for an audience of one, and one is with a capital O, with all institutions, corporations, sects, civil society, media singing the same tune. It is a terrifying spectacle on any proper measure of democracy. So, Yaqoob.
You're very right. It is quite terrifying. But let me just begin from where Siddharth left. And it's very interesting. Even when the judgment came out in 2019, what was really fascinating is, and again, people don't read history, and that's why history is the most contested subject. There were, what the judgment actually said, and what the ASF report also said is there was some remnants of something there between the 12th and the 14th century. Now, of course, there was no evidence that there was a mandir. There was no evidence that it was just destroyed on the orders of any Mughal and blah, blah, blah. That's there. But what's really fascinating is if you keep going back and if you keep digging deeper, you will find a Buddhist relic there also. So now the interesting thing is if you dig deeper under the Ram temple and you find a Buddhist monastery under it or a Buddhist temple under it, would you take down the Ram temple because it was built upon a Buddhist one? So I think this thing of just keep going back to history and trying to make archaeology into current reality, it is only political. There is nothing beyond it. And now to the quote that you read by PBM, it was very interesting that when the inauguration happened, what Prime Minister Modi said to everyone was stay at your home and celebrate it there. That's a very interesting sign of creating that one. Because you're not asking people to come, you are saying come after the inauguration, then you can come and do whatever. But in order to ensure that I am here as the representative of all the 1.2 billion Indians, and therefore you don't need to come here. I am there to represent you. This is a new level of Raj Dharma, that ancient Hindu concept where the Hindu king is the embodiment of the god, right? So I think that is why it is kind of very dangerous. One other thing that I really want to mention, because some people have mentioned it, especially on the Pakistan side, Gandhi also spoke of Ram Raj and, this is all of that. Gandhi did not speak of this kind of Ram Raj. He never asked for a Ram temple at Ayodhya. His was a philosophical point of, justice and all of that, which of course had religious undertones, but he never kind of went this far. So I think that's also very important that what they've done is they have taken bits and pieces from all the history of India and they have knit together a new kind of identity, a new kind of a mindset, a new kind of a of course, I would say as a historian, an ill-educated view of the past, but that is something that keeps on and on. And let me just give you one quick example of Pakistan here. We always love to compare India and Pakistan. This sense of Hindu kind of scared, this idea that Hindus need to be concerned about the minorities and be scared of them. That was very much in Pakistan in its initial few decades when it was the other way around. Muslims were in a majority and Hindus were in a minority. And the majority kept getting scared of the minority, and the minority kept saying, but we are a minority. How are you scared of us? So that kind of a minority complex has now flipped and has come in India. There is no way Muslims can take over Hindus. But you have people who are saying that, in 2050, there'll be more Muslims in India than Hindus, which is complete rubbish. But that is
this has been going on since the mid 90s when that report came out, about demographics and all that. But no, I know. I mean, this is a topic in and of itself on which we can, have like a 2-hour discussion. But I'm just kind of quickly checking boxes here. So coming to the BJP's muscular security policy, it's very interesting, SV, and I'm quoting from your article from last November, in which you're talking about the Nikhil Gupta, the Indian national resident who was formally indicted in a New York court. And you wrote, mentioning for plotting the murder in the United States of a US citizen active in the Khalistan movement contains a katina of which I thought was a very interesting and appropriate word. Katina of allegations that are extremely damaging for the reputation of those at the helm of national security in India. And of course, you have gone on and, as you know, recently our Foreign Office has also mentioned the names of people and you mentioned some of these killings in Pakistan in your piece. But it's interesting that now, of course, names are being named here also. This muscular security policy, as you mentioned in your piece, a long piece, is not really redounded to India's advantage. And yet, it seems that this is something which has been well thought out, not at the lower echelons of the government, but probably at the highest echelons.
Well, traditionally I'm going to try not to be moral on this and urge all of us not to be moral. But in the realm of activities that states do, throughout the world and throughout history, states have always acted extraterritorially.
Correct.
But they've done so in the face of actual threats, and they have done so on the basis of a cost-benefit calculation, where you assess what is the benefit in terms of my security from undertaking a certain set of actions vis-a-vis the cost, because every action comes with the cost. So whether it's Israel or the United States or India or Russia, Iran, countries that, India now appears to have joined this camp of countries that stand accused or have actually engaged in targeted assassinations of unfriendly elements in other countries. The question that all of these people ask before they embark on a mission is, well, what happens if I don't succeed? What happens if we get caught? Is that risk worth taking, given the kind of payoff that I expect? Right. So I'm sure that President Obama would have thought about this when it came to taking out Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, and they would have come to the conclusion that this is a risk worth taking. When it comes to India, if we accept for the moment that the allegations by Canada and the FBI are correct, these targets are not people who pose any kind of a security threat to India today. The Khalistan movement is over and done with. Some remnants of it may survive at the level of diasporic politics and propaganda in North America, maybe Australia. But they don't matter on the ground in Punjab.
But Prime Minister Modi, during the farmers' movement, was actually invoking the Khalistani hand behind the movement constantly.
This is it, and I think that gives us a clue as to why Prime Minister Modi and the Indian state would play up a threat that is actually non-existent, and play it up to such an extent that you then go on a crazy, if the Canadian and US allegations are to be believed, on a crazy assassination spree at great cost to India's reputation in British Columbia and New York, right? So so I think the reason is entirely to do with domestic politics. That somewhere down the line, Prime Minister Modi wants to play up the idea, and maybe this is again part of this cultivation of a Hindu vote bank, right? So you
but SV, hold on. Let's just rewind. So you said Katina, and I said that this is a very appropriate term, because we seem to have like a trend developing, whether it's picking up kidnapping someone on high seas, whether it's in the Caribbean, whether it's in Canada, whether it's in New York, whether it's in Pakistan, which for India does not really matter because they believe that Pakistan doesn't have the kind of diplomatic heft or space to press this point. There is a trend. So it does not say, and of course, it may be for political reasons, and I'm sure it is for political reasons. But there is also, it seems, that a certain kind of security culture has evolved over the last 8, 9, 10 years, which seems to be a complete break from the past.
Yeah. So I think let's separate out that security mindset, right? Which one could characterize as either, if you want to do it in a benign way, a greater willingness to take a risk, Or if you want to be more blunt, you could say it's a certain kind of recklessness, right, of committing Indian military assets outside its borders. Now, in each of the instances that I've cited in my article, which is the abduction on the high seas of Princess Latifa, and then the attempted kidnapping of Mehul Choksi in Antigua, each of the triggers or reasons are different. So, in the case of Princess Latifa, the government of India wanted to do a favor to the ruler of Dubai, and had in mind something that it could ask for in return, which was the extradition of Christian Michel, whom they hoped would be able to somehow embroil Sonia Gandhi and the Congress party in a corruption scam. That didn't work, but that's a different story. In the case of Mehul Choksi, here was a high-profile diamond dealer who defrauded public sector banks and fled the country. Very damaging photographs of himself and his near and dear ones with Prime Minister Modi had surfaced at the time jab wo chuna laga ke bhag gaya. And clearly the BJP wanted to bring this guy back to somehow say that, look, Mr. Modi is not in bed with this guy, right? So there was a compulsion there. In the case of the Canadian and US incidents, I would link this to what you said, Mr. Modi's allegation about the farmers' movement in India, that you are trying to paint an exaggerated picture of the Khalistan threat, perhaps to justify a certain securitization of foreign policy, militarization, but more importantly, I think to drive home to the Hindu voter that you are trying to scare. You're trying to scare him by saying कि जी मुसलमानों की आबादी बढ़ रही है. You're trying to scare him into believing कि जी सिखों से दोबारा खतरा आ रहा है. You're trying to scare him in a wide variety of ways. There is no threat from Khalistanis. But you, by creating this bogeyman, ki ji, Kisan, the farmers' movement is linked to them. These guys in Canada are disrupting Indian national security. So I think that domestic political imperative.
No, I understand. I perfectly understand. There is the domestic political imperative. But at the same time, it is evolving a certain kind of security culture. Which
it's reckless,
obviously,
it's misplaced and highly damaging for India's national security interests, quite frankly.
Right. So, surgical strikes and then post-Pulwama and attacks. So all of this, some of these were covert operations, some of these were overt operations, declared operations after the operations were launched. So there's a bit of that recklessness that you're talking about. But we talked about the consecration of Ram Temple. We talked about the SC's decision. There is also another SC decision, the Indian Supreme Court's decision, with reference to Kashmir. And I was watching Karan Thapar's interview on The Wire with Fali Nariman.
Yeah.
And Mr. Nariman pointed out that Article 3 of the Constitution does not permit, because it does not empower the government to reduce a state to union territory status. And he also identified 4 or 5 different errors made by the Supreme Court in 2 specific aspects of its judgment, upholding the dilution of Article 370 and reorganizing Jammu and Kashmir, both in terms of the size of the territory, as well as in terms of reducing its status from a state to a union territory. And then the most important point, he said he believes the judgment is totally erroneous and bad in law. Now, just to clarify, and this is a point on which I would also want Yaqoob to come in. As far as we in Pakistan are concerned, we are not concerned about Article 370 per se, because we have never accepted the accession to India. But for us, we have agitated this point simply because for us, it essentially changes, or India's attempt to change the nature of the dispute under the UN resolutions. But right now, we're going to focus on what the Indian Supreme Court has done, starting with USV.
Well, my views on the judgment mirror that of, Mr. Fali Nariman. I've argued from day one that the Modi government's move is unconstitutional, and that if at all an attempt was to be made to dilute or get rid of Article 370, then the only way for that to happen is by recourse, by making a reference to some kind of an elected body of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Until it was dissolved in the 50s, you had the J&K Constituent Assembly, and since then you've had J&K Legislative Assembly. At the very least, even though lawyers may split hairs as to whether the Legislative Assembly can stand in for the Constituent Assembly, but certainly a Legislative Assembly, insofar as it is supposed to reflect the views of the electorate, has some kind of a legal standing compared to the personal view of the governor, of the lieutenant governor, who is simply an appointee of the union government and who actually acts on their advice, right? So the entire thing was fraudulent in my view, and it was also, quite frankly, again, from the point of view of statecraft, quite unnecessary. And I would say it was largely, again, driven by Mr. Modi's domestic politics. Nobody from the Indian security establishment prior to Mr. Modi coming to power seriously argued in favor of getting rid of Article 370, because they knew that this was not a serious obstacle as far as the Indian state was concerned in its dealings with J&K. And I don't want to reopen the whole issue. We can maybe discuss that but serious practitioners of Indian statecraft knew that the Indian state could have its way vis-a-vis the people of Jammu and Kashmir, even with Article 370 in place. There was no reason to get rid of it, right? Except for the domestic political.
So taking a cue from what you've said, SV, do you think, or shall I say, would you agree with my impression that it's almost like Mr. Modi is checking boxes in the BJP manifesto about the deliverables?
I think that it's the world as a whole, and certainly in India and in Pakistan, people need to realize that the BJP is pretty serious when it comes to its manifesto, and when it comes to the ideological part of its manifesto. When they say "Garibi hatayenge" ya sabko ghar denge, that's a different matter. But the ideological products of its manifesto. If you go back to 98, Ejaz, the world was stunned when Mr. Vajpayee tested nuclear devices, but it was there in their manifesto, right? Yeah. And similarly, 370 is there. Lots of other things that they've been doing. The Ram Temple was there.
Yeah.
So they do all these things, right? So I think that the important lesson to be learned, and here I want to take us more in the plane of Indo-Pak relations. And I tried to say this in Lahore at one of the events where I was speaking at the Think Fest, one of the sessions, that the real import or the real meaning of what Mr. Modi did by getting rid of Article 370 vis-a-vis Kashmir is to firmly establish, or rather to tell Pakistan, that Kashmir will no longer be a subject of discussion between India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going into the normative aspects of this. Is this good? Is this bad? But from the point of view of realpolitik, this is the new reality. That
right, and he wanted to ensure that. So as you said, this is a discussion for which we need a separate program.
Yes.
But I want to quickly bring in Yaqoob on this, and then I need to pace it up. But Yaqoob, before you say anything, I want to read out an excerpt from Anuradha Bhasin's article. And she says, the Supreme Court's 476-page verdict upholding the abrogation of Article 370 is a saga of historical distortion, selective amnesia, and logicless interpretation. Not only does it do injustice to Jammu and Kashmir, it has set a precedent that is inimical to Indian democracy and federalism. Yaqoob.
I just want to mention one thing here, of course, because Kashmir, of course, relates to my work on princely states. And I should just say India, just like in India and in Pakistan, all states signed an accession document. And then when they were merged, they signed a merger document, which happened in India, which also happened in Pakistan. This did not happen in India with Kashmir. They created a Constituent Assembly. The Constituent Assembly, developed a constitution. What I found really fascinating was the fact they took the declaration in February 1949 of the Yuvraj, who was not the Maharaja, the Yuvraj, saying we are now completely a part of India. There is nothing to be done, which is very interesting, because if this were the case, then India did not have to sign merger agreements with any of the other princely states. They could have just declared it. So this was breaking with the practice that India had already done with other princely states. And I really do want to agree with what SB said. The whole thing, of course, they were getting away after the 60s, in whatever they wanted to do in Kashmir. The main signal of that Modi was trying to give was, of course, we are ticking all the boxes, but also to Pakistan that this is no longer an issue for us, and we will not discuss this, because Pakistan is now at the back foot. So there is, Ejaz, what you were saying earlier, there is a pattern, but there is a pattern because we are really, the liberal consensus as it was in the world in the post-World War II era has broken down, and now people just do, we get away with whatever we want to, and India is pushing the boundaries there because no one can really take up a fight with India. And they've really clearly shown it with Canada, and they've shown it with Pakistan and other countries.
Right. Of course, I mean, this is something, in fact, Mr. A.G. Noorani, who demonstrably is one of the most incisive legal minds, and he wrote this excellent book on Article 370 and how it has been hollowed out over the years. He also wrote, a very incisive piece for The Wire after the Supreme Court verdict. But I want to move on now to the saffronization of Indian Army, which I think is very important in many ways. In fact, there's an article in The Wire. I mean, clearly SV is doing wonderful things with his portal. And this is by P. Raman. And the headline says, by supporting politicized, saffronized barracks, Bipin Rawat, the late Bipin Rawat, made himself Modi's perfect CDS. And then in scroll.in, Sanjeev Krishan Sood, who was director, I think he was Director General at the Border Security Force, spoke about, even serving officers in uniforms, attending rallies and seminars of right-wing Hindutva organizations. How much of a problem is this becoming, SV?
This is emerging as the next kind of horror story of Indian democracy, quite frankly. Okay. Because what began as, the usual tendency we see in many countries of the brass kind of sucking up to the political establishment, right? I mean, all democracies have this to a lesser or greater degree, where appointments are, where there is discretion on the government's part, then you have people the higher they get up the food chain in the services, currying favor in order to get plum posts or to get the top job, right? So what started off as that has today, become a situation where many, there's a growing body of evidence suggesting that top officers are quite happy to play along with this kind of politicization, allowing the BJP's ideology to make inroads. We had the horrible spectacle of former Army, Navy, and Air Force chiefs. I think there were about a dozen of them that I counted in that photograph, turning up for the Ram Temple, inauguration, which was, clearly a political event, right? I mean, even if you have misplaced sort of religious feelings, and I'm saying misplaced,
they could have gone later for
exactly. I mean, the fact that you turn up for what is demonstrably a political event, is a very, very bad sign. And I saw the photograph of, I think, 12 of them at the Dogra Regimental Center in Ayodhya. And that photograph was first shared with me by a former Navy chief, in great anguish, saying, look at this photograph. And then, a lot of other veterans have expressed their displeasure at this in public, which is a good thing. And we even saw a speech by, I think, head of India's Western Command, where he emphasized the importance of, the secular, apolitical nature of the Indian Army. So it's not as if this project of politicizing the armed forces has fully succeeded or has even reached a certain critical level, but it's there. we would be blind if we ignored this trend. It's a dangerous trend, and I think that the sooner better sense prevails, either at the level of the political leadership, that please don't mess with the nature of the Indian armed forces. The better it'll be, and at the level of the armed forces leadership too, they should realize that allowing a certain ideology to make inroads is going to be very harmful for the armed forces, for their future, and for frankly, the security interests of the country.
But there are two things, SV, and I would want your comment on those two things, and then I want Yaqoob to also have a word on this. One is, of course, recruitment at the lower levels also, and recruitment for the officer cadre also, whether it's at the National Defense Academy, whether it's at Dehradun. These candidates and these officer cadets come from various parts of India. And if you see how there are these societal changes happening, and then you also juxtapose them with the acculturation that happens at the academies, and it's the same with PMA, that acculturation happens everywhere. If the professional requirements of the army or the military, so to speak, if the differential between societal trends and those professional requirements increases, then the acculturation process itself comes under a lot of tension. So I want your comment on that. And secondly, of course, at the higher level of the brass, if politicization reaches a point where it also begins to impact promotions and appointments, then it is easier for officers, even somewhat competent officers, to actually say, okay, if I go against the trend, then I will not be able to achieve what I want to achieve, given my capacity or my capabilities. And that then begins a very dispiriting cycle.
So in response to your first question, I would say there's always been a gap between the sort of popular culture at one level, or social norms, societal norms at one level, and the culture in the armed forces. And the nature of the training process, the esprit de corps within the army, right down to the platoon level and so on, has always ensured that the Indian enlisted man or woman emerges with and reflects a certain broad-minded secular ethos. Okay. And so I'm hoping that if indeed the BJP intends to undermine that ethos, that this is not something that can happen very quickly. But it's very clear that the BJP, their project is well defined, which is to have India as what they call a Hindu Rashtra. They believe it's already a Hindu Rashtra, and this will have different aspects. And so that's the direction they want to go in. But I'm hoping that this will be resisted by the inertia of the military training system. But who knows? The second question is, again, a perennial problem, right? In the past, we've seen examples of this, not just with Mr. Modi. There have been examples of officers who have tried to butter up defense ministers or other politicians and tried to get ahead. And the problem is that that's happened. That was always more or less at an individual level, right? So you had an individually ambitious person currying favor with a certain leader and then hoping to get ahead. What's happening now, I think, which is what is disturbing, and I'm not saying it's happening now, but I can see the ingredients of that if the government is going to insist on having a committed cadre of upper echelon officers, and by committed I mean people who believe in the sort of BJP RSS worldview, then sure, there will be officers who will say, might as well pay lip service to this in order to get ahead. I don't know if you follow this in Pakistan, but there was a horrible piece that I read recently by a senior Indian administrative officer in Maharashtra. This is a woman officer who in 1992 was a trainee in the IAS Academy in Mussoorie. And she says how when they got news of the Babri Masjid having been demolished, their first instinct was to celebrate. And she says, I ate a peda, like a
Yeah.
mithai in celebration. And she said that I was pulled up in 1992 for doing that. But now that the mandir has finally been built, I ate another peda and I feel so happy about it. And she's talking about an event that the Supreme Court called an egregious violation of the Constitution. Now, how are we to trust a civil servant who swears by the Constitution when she not only admits to having had a peda when a mosque was demolished, but now is coming out openly and is doing so because she knows there'll be no adverse consequences?
So a quick question and a quick response before I go to Yaqoob. So your father was an Indian Administrative Service officer.
Yeah.
So you grew up in that sort of, ethos and in those environs. How different was that time from this peda eating times?
I'm sure such individuals always existed, perhaps, but the ethos that we grew up in and the kind of India that we saw and the schools that we went to were very different from what is being projected 24/7 in the media over the last 7-8 years. Right, it's a very different India. I'm still hoping that India, which is being projected and being imposed on us, is still not what the country has already become, although that's the direction they want to take it in. But it would have been unthinkable for IAS officers to have even had the instinct of wanting to celebrate the demolition of a mosque. I mean, how insane! If anything, even if they were even if they were a Ram Bhakt, my dad was a Ram Bhakt, incidentally. His instinct would be, the demolition of a mosque is the topi of a law enforcement official kicks in, right? So as a DM, you say, this is a violation of the majesty of the state. How dare these buggers do this? They need to be taught a lesson. That's the typical mindset of a bureaucrat, right? That these guys have attacked the state. This is not just, in other words, they would see this not just as an attack on a mosque, but an attack on the Indian state, which is what it was, right? So for this person now to come out and, and she's doing so because she knows there'll be not only that there will be no consequences.
Yeah, but the state and the religion have merged in a way which is scary. But Yaqoob, your thoughts on this with reference to the saffronization of the armed forces, and also, by the way, lots of people are talking about, and I'm not just saying it out of thin air, but in Indian writings about the saffronization of the higher judiciary also.
Yeah. Well, actually, you guys have covered the army well, so I would want to talk about the judiciary. Again, the 2019 judgment was from the Supreme Court on Babri Mosque was, didn't have the signature of the writing judge. Same about the Kashmir one. So there is a clear pattern that whenever, I think now the thing is, when the Indian Supreme Court doesn't sign off a judgment, means it's kind of a bogus one. It has deep questions. But again, one can look at this. In the 1980s, the Indian Supreme Court led the way in the world in public interest litigation, the ideas of, basic structure and all those other kinds of things. And look at how within just 10 years, it has flipped. And now it is next to impossible for the superior judiciary to even go against anything that the government of the day does. And the government, of course, does control things through the collegium and through promotions and all of that. We all know the example of a former chief justice being appointed as a member of the Rajya Sabha. But let me actually give a very, very simple example to illustrate. I'm sure both of you remember that a few months ago they renamed Mughal Garden in the president's house.
Yeah.
And was really fascinating was the very next day, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India was visiting it. And it, in front of all TV cameras, the president was showing him around. It was the same garden. Nothing changed. They just changed the name. And you've got the Chief Justice of India with all his brother and sister judges, looking at it as if it's the first time they've seen it. They've seen it a million times. But these are the subtle things in which things are changing. They are not going to come out. And I think this really needs to be underlined. It's the same case in the Israel-Palestine issue. Whereas, of course, Israel is a bit mad with this, but very few people are really going to come out and say, oh, I want to commit genocide. It is all, you have to look at what actions are being done and what they amount to, rather than saying, oh, as we said, that Jaishankar said, yeah, everyone's equal. There is no problem. Of course, they are never going to say, you never get a tweet from the Prime Minister of India saying, go and kill this and do that. Of course, you won't get it. You'll always get good things out of it. But that doesn't mean that the things aren't happening under the belt. And I think that is where because it's now a generational change. Now you will get, now let's say the NDA government comes back for a third time, a generation would have risen up against, under their government, and they would have been fed these kinds of ideologies. And for them, this will be the new normal. And I think that's the real danger now.
Okay. So I've almost run out of time. So very quickly, like 2 or 3 minutes. SV, the India bloc, Nitish Kumar has actually gone and joined the BJP. And from what the pundits are writing, or at least from a distance, what we read, seems like the BJP is going to probably win this third iteration also. What are your thoughts about that? And of course, that kind of then goes into everything that we have discussed previously in the program.
Well, I think it's too early to say what the outcome of the Lok Sabha election is going to be. Undoubtedly, the exit of Nitish Kumar is a setback for the India coalition. But I think that as the campaign gets underway, we will have a better sense. So I think that I would still, look at the election as being open. Of course, as Prime Minister, as incumbent, as somebody with a huge amount of money power under his control, and with the state basically functioning as an election arm of the Bharatiya Janata Party, clearly Mr. Modi has an upper hand. But I wouldn't say the verdict is a done deal by any means.
Okay.
It's not just the verdict.
It's very difficult to predict Indian elections. But SV, another thing, as I said in my opening, you've been around for 30 years in this profession. How do you feel today in terms of what you can write, your safety and security, people talking about and then essentially getting fired or sacked, or publications coming under threat of income tax laws and the rest of it? How would you rate the media scene right now?
I personally don't feel threatened. I don't see any threat to my life or in that way. But there is I do worry about colleagues across India who live in great uncertainty that stories they file or publications they put out may annoy somebody in power and lead to the filing of a police case. So this criminalization of journalism, which is now a new trend, is something which bothers me. And I would say literally over 250 journalists across India have been caught up in this at different levels, particularly our colleagues in Jammu and Kashmir. And secondly, it's very clear that the government is irritated with the functioning of digital media, particularly digital video. So we have a whole ecosystem of YouTubers in India. Perhaps you have them in Pakistan too, who are tapping into public disaffection with big media. We call it the Godi media, the lapdog media, and who are out there in the streets reporting and conveying a better sense of ground reality than the big TV channels are doing. So the government is annoyed by the fact that they're not able to bell this cat. So they have drafted a whole bunch of new laws and regulations, which will go into high gear, I think, if Mr. Modi gets re-elected. So there will be restrictions and an attempt to throttle the independent media. So this is an occupational hazard, quite frankly, that's going to get worse.
This has become an occupational hazard. By the way, since you mentioned Jammu and Kashmir, Yaqoob, before that, just an excerpt from an Indian report filed on 26 Jan 2024, which is this year. Since the beginning of this year, the Jammu and Kashmir police and security forces have been asking the residents of the Union Territory to fill up questionnaire forms seeking their personal details without any explanation. Yaqoob, quickly, minute and a half.
Yeah, well, I agree to an extent with Siddharth that the elections are too open at the moment. I should say, Nitish Kumar's jumping, Paltu Ram as he's called, he's flipped again. Let's not forget that the RJD.
But he's accusing Congress of queering the pitch as far as the leadership issue is concerned.
2 years ago, he was accusing the BJP. So, that's always there. And of course, it's a setback. But I think one very important thing to remember is that even in the Bihar Assembly, The RJD has nearly twice as many seats as Janata Dal. So to say that, he will be the decisive factor, yes, of course, he was a major important leader, but I think in the last 10 years, he's flipped so many times that people have kind of forgotten where he's been. So this is kind of, a setback, but not the breaking point. I think the key point is about seat adjustment. And if you do the mathematics and they do the seat adjustment well, I think there is a good chance for the India alliance to at least make some dents. Will they get a majority? That's very hard to say. But I think the seat adjustment thing, and if they all collaborate and work together, at least they will increase substantially their number of votes and seats.
Okay. Thank you so much, Siddharth Varadarajan. Thank you, Dr. Yaqoob Bangash. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.